If you're anything like me, politics is probably pretty important to you, although you might also agree that from time to time a little less could be beneficial also. But what about science literacy? Here's a question for you. Could a lack of science literacy actually be a threat to democracy? Well, joining me today to talk about that is Professor Michael J. Thompson. He's the co-editor of a new anthology entitled Anti-Science and the Assault on Democracy. We're going to get into that subject with him right now. Michael J. Thompson is a professor of political theory in the Department of Political Science at William Paterson University. His areas of focus are in theories of justice, criminal theory, Marxism, German idealism, moral philosophy, and the history of political thought. And his forthcoming books include The Specter of Babel, Toward a Reconstruction of Political Judgment, and Twilight of the Self, The Eclipse of Autonomy in Modern Society, from Stanford University Press. He is also the founding editor of Logos, a journal of modern society and culture. And I'm excited to be talking about an anthology with him today that he is the co-editor of. It's called Anti-Science and the Assault on Democracy. Michael, welcome to the program.
Hi, Micah. Thanks for having me.
Yes, so good to have you here. This is, I think, such an important subject at the current time. And, I don't want to open the interview on an overtly ideological note, but I also feel that there may be no better way to lead off than a quote, which is a tweet from our president dated January 20th, 2019 at 6:59 a.m. And it reads, "Be careful and try staying in your house. Large parts of the country are suffering from tremendous amounts of snow and near record-setting cold. Amazing how big this system is. Wouldn't be bad, he says, to have a little of that good old-fashioned global warming right now." Michael, when I saw this, I first went to his Twitter account to make sure it wasn't a Photoshop job. It is real. But I want to ask you, what does this say about the current state of science literacy in our culture?
It does express not only, I think, an ignorance of science, but also a hostility toward science. And I don't mean just science as a technique in the world about understanding nature. I also mean it as an attitude. I mean, as an attitude among the citizenry about being open to fact, about revising their own ideas about how they think the world works. It's not only about scientific literacy. I think things have become a little bit worse. I think there's moving into now an outright hostility against reason itself.
Yeah, I think that part of the problem that we're seeing right now is twofold. For me, I think that right now, with the technological aspect of science, and you make a distinction between technology and science as a sort of philosophy or as a sort of a reason through which we can operate more effectively and, frankly, democratically. I want to get into that with you, but to me, at the current time, with the technologization, I guess, of society and the access to technology forms, it's interesting that you would think that would make people more scientifically inclined. In many ways, the opposite seems to be the effect. And so what are your thoughts about the technological element in society today as it relates to the need for scientific thinking?
It's interesting you put it that way. There's this aspect to technology, which is this, if you go back to the images of what technology, how, I guess, modern cultures in, say, science fiction and things would have imagined technology as this kind of large-scale, massive force in the world. You think of the computer in 2001: A Space Odyssey killing off the people, the crew. You think of like all sorts of these different kind of metaphors about technology as this massive, machine taking over human beings. The transformation in technology over the past 20 years, though, has kind of made that metaphor obsolete. In other words, I think in the 1960s, 50s, and 60s, and 70s, people saw the pathway of technology as becoming larger and bigger and more massive. And even though that is true, the way we experience technology is actually become smaller and smaller and smaller. The cell phone, the iPad, and things like this. So in many ways, what technology does is kind of break our link between our activities and the consequences of our activities. And what science does is something that's the opposite. Science tries to link, in many ways, our thoughts about the world, our activities in the world, with what is objectively out there and real. So in some ways, they're two they're two forms of they're two forms of our culture that are pushing and pulling in different directions. And I think with the technology, people have been able, especially the way social media and this kind of technology, people don't experience it as technology as much anymore. They really think of it as, or experience it as, a substitute for how you relate to others. And I think in that respect, they just don't see it as technological. They see it as a way to share information or share their worldviews, which, ironically enough, can be anti-scientific or anti-technological.
Yeah. Michael, something that comes to mind here, we have to rely on relativity. We have to rely on our understandings of gravity afforded us by Albert Einstein in order for, satellite networking systems to account for global communication in the moment, in the second. And yet, people of, for instance, the Flat Earth movement, how that became a thing, boy, explain that one to me. But they will argue their points in ignorance of the scientific principles that allow that communication to occur in the first place. I mean, talk about irony.
You talk about irony and talk about the idea that scientific fact or scientific ideas are now the thing of conspiracy theory.
Right. Right.
Which is really interesting. It's
interesting. It's frightening in a lot of ways, too. I want to come to something that was in the introduction to Anti-Science and the Assault on Democracy. You and your co-editor write, "It is our contention that tendencies that defend anti-science views in the name of democratic pluralism, whether invoked by the left or the right, are actually destructive of a broader culture and the mindset appropriate for a democratic society." And you go on to illuminate other aspects of this, but I want to just skip ahead to this part. You say, "In this respect, we believe that we are witnessing a peculiar new manifestation of anti-science belief systems that are in spirit akin to a premodern worldview, but carry new consequences in contemporary society and politics." I think this is really, really important because you point out that this is an issue that we have to address nonpartisanly, and also that really the idea of science literacy is completely in line with and perhaps necessary for democracy. Can we talk about that a bit?
Of course, yeah. Let's start with the last part first.
Sure.
Science literacy as not simply being literate in the facts of what science has brought forth, the dominant theories, whether it's relativity or evolution or something like this. At a more fundamental level, science literacy as kind of an acknowledgement of what the activity of science actually is. And I think this has to be unpacked. This is really, really significant because in many ways, science has within it, one of the powerful things about science, what makes science kind of democratic, is it's kind of twofold capacity. On the one hand, to foster a rational skepticism about authority. Mm-hmm. And I think that is very significant. And secondly, the capacity for that skepticism not to become a cynicism, but an openness to transforming our understanding about the objective world. And that's something, those two things have to go together. That no matter what the scientific studies may say, there'll be another scientific study that might actually, refute it 2 weeks later. That's the nature of science. But in the popular culture, especially the way it's reported in journalism, every day someone will wake up and say, "Oh, you're not supposed to eat bread." The next day, "Oh, you can eat butter." Oh, no one knows what they're talking about. These elites are completely confused. Science doesn't mean anything. They say one thing, they say another thing the next day. This is all baloney. And I think this is part of the idea of the scientific literacy turning into a skepticism about elites and expertise, people who think they know stuff, people who think they know things because they think about it, as opposed to me, who I know things because I know what I know. I know what's right in front of me. I know what I can put my hands on. And that's the Flat Earth movement. That's the anti-vax vaccination movement. Don't tell me what I see in front of me is wrong. How dare you tell me that I'm wrong and you're right, and this is an insult to my dignity. So these things are connected. the cultural, because, the thing that's happening is, in many ways, the massification of technology, the massification of kind of rational systems, whether they're economic systems or whether they're computerized systems, or all these things are blending together, systems of power, systems of education. These are really alienating everyday people. It's not like this is not happening. The economic inequality is rising. Jobs are being de-skilled, and where they're not even being replaced sometimes by robotics or technology. They're real crises that people are experiencing. The problem is, in many ways, that they can't grasp the systems that are responsible for how it affects their actual individual world, their actual phenomenal world, the world that they experience. And this translates over into a hostility toward science, toward scientific expertise, and ultimately, I think, toward reason. And that goes back to the other quote that you read, where you kind of see this reversal into pre-modern forms of knowing, pre-modern forms of kind of relating to the world, whether it be like in terms of not even established religion, but in terms of more superstitious ways of thinking about the world. These are all ways, I think, of people being unable to make sense of a world that is becoming increasingly alienating to them.
Yeah, I see exactly where you're going with that. There's a really good way of putting it too, Michael, because, again, in pre-modern societies, without the advancements and the knowledge that we had of the mechanics of the universe, we perceived basically supernaturally. There is the idea of an entity, a deity, whatever else, spirits, demons, specters that influence reality. Everything from, and you point this out in your essay in the book, if you actually look at the etymological roots of influenza, it goes back to the idea of influence, and that goes back to ideas of, I know in Greece they would call it the matiasma, but the evil eye. The idea that there's a supernatural influence and that someone, if they point at you or look at you the wrong way, you could get deathly ill. Science helps us learn that those supernatural forces aren't what govern reality. But what doesn't go away, even in a technological society, is people's fundamental reckoning with reality, trying to understand the causal relationships between the things that they see and experience and the actual principles that govern those things, the underlying elements. Now, here's the trick to me. We have at our disposal now, at our fingertips, smartphone technologies. We can get online, we can read at Wikipedia, we can actually go to sites like, Stanford University's website, which has all kinds of wonderful information. YouTube, you can find entire YouTube channels that are devoted to entry-level college courses taught at MIT by MIT professors. And yet that information, despite being so readily apparent and available at our fingertips, literally, people don't often go there. The trick seems to be trying to understand, how to encourage people to go looking for good information. And to me, I want your thoughts on this. It comes back to the idea that with science, we don't go out seeking to prove things. We don't just go out trying to validate, our theories. We have a check for falsehood, which helps us limit the possibilities, and then we narrow down based on that what is most likely. How do we teach people in a constructive way of thinking in a democratic society to do the same thing?
The core for me, it goes back to the, in the ancient Greek world, they believed that in philosophy or science, that the purpose of these exercises, of learning about nature, the world, was very different than in the modern world. In the modern world, Francis Bacon, one of the originators of, the kind of modern scientific method, said that, the purpose of science in many ways is control. It was the control of nature.
Yeah.
In the Greek world, it was not that at all. In the Greek world, the reason that you wanted to know about these things wasn't for control, but for what they called wonder, curiosity. And I think that something has been happening in our culture that has made our worlds very small. And I think it has to do with the fact that the way we educate our children, the way our culture is shaped and formed around commodification and consumption, and these kinds of things, that in many ways we've not eliminated, but certainly reduced the power of curiosity and wonder. There is no, I remember my own, fascination with science coming from watching public television series like Cosmos when I was a kid. And it made me, that fascination with those kind of questions, those kinds of realities, that made me, as I got older, say to myself, no, I want to discipline myself to learn algebra or calculus. Why? Because there was a purpose now to it, the wonder to figure things out. If that isn't there, then all of these kind of techniques you need to learn to even have scientific literacy become a burden, an obstacle to your immediate forms of gratification. And we've created a society, I think, that really doesn't care about these things. It cares more about material gain. It cares more about immediate gratification. It doesn't care about these large-scale questions. And you can see this reflected not only in the everyday life of people. You could see this reflected in the popular culture. You could see this reflected in the kind of television shows people watch, the kind of movies that people watch. The society is not moving toward one where we're actually trying to be curious and adventurous. And what does that mean? It means it means something happens within the human mind, and a distinction between an open and closed mind. An open mind is always looking for something different and new because it wants to transform itself. Or even if it doesn't want to transform itself, it will based on new information. But the closed mind refuses. The closed mind refuses to look for that new information. And if the new information does arise or emerge, the closed mind will find every way to dispel it or avoid it or repress it. And there's a famous book from 1960, actually, by Milton Rokeach, the psychologist, called The Open and Closed Mind. And he has a whole argument about how this gets shaped by socialization. And I think in many ways, this is part of the seed of the problem, that we've been, if you think about the decades of the Cold War, the 1950s, 60s, 70s, and the 80s, when I was young, there was still a need in the national interest, in a way, for scientific education to be in some way a crucial part of what it meant to be as a general education in America. Why? Because we were competing with another scientifically, technologically advanced society.
Right.
Soviet Union. We had to compete economically in terms of development and growth. And now, after 1989, after with the global move of globalization and all of these concerns started to evaporate. All of them started to evaporate. So there's not the same impetus, say, for the state to put these kinds of educational imperatives within the culture. And I think this has had a big effect, a very big effect on scientific literacy, but also, more importantly, it's had a real effect on science's ability to open up the democratic or the human mind.
Very interesting. I wasn't going to get into this early in the interview, but I think this is a natural segue to the way that in some aspects, policy, as a result of world affairs, changes, and therefore when different imperatives are put forth and different aspects of culture driving policy, how that can affect science literacy. Now, some would say, for instance, we open with the tweet, where, again, I mean to quote Donald Trump in this capacity as a broader statement on the culture and democracy in America right now. I have plenty of concerns about it. I'm pretty sure you and I would share them in that regard. Mm-hmm. But now here's the thing. We can actually look back at several of the last, several presidencies spanning the last several decades, and we can really kind of see some interesting areas where policies are being enacted that change the public attitude toward and overall literacy towards science. Some of the examples you guys list in the anthology we're discussing, Anti-Science and the Assault on Democracy, include, for instance, an aversion to teaching evolution in schools, things like this, environmental policy, all these kind of things. Can we get into a little bit about how policy, especially after the end of the Cold War, where there was a great need for scientific and technological advancement. It meant basically, it really meant a way of life to us here in the West. As that shift changes in peacetime, how is policy affected by it?
Well, I think one way that policy is affected by the shift is that you have to see that there's also other strands within the culture over the post-war half century that were also significant. And I think one of them was the reaction to the 1960s that began to take root in the 1970s as a kind of countercultural revolt against the civil rights movement, against the kind of new left movements of the 60s, anti-consumption pattern, cultures, new music, these kinds of experimentation, these kinds of things that were kind of becoming emerging in the 60s as a result of the boredom and ennui of the affluent society. That by the time 1980 comes around, there is a reaction, a conservative reaction against these movements. And religious part of this reaction, a big plank of this movement on the platform of the Republican Party, became giving to the base, which were largely religious conservatives, religious conservatives, particularly from the South and the Midwest, the Bible Belt. And I think actually in a lot of ways, this is a really important part of the story because it has had a deep effect on modern liberal society. That liberalism says we have to, respect the different opinions of others. I mean, this goes to the root of what liberal philosophy is, even within the 20th century. The idea that, well, no one really knows, no one shouldn't violate other people's conception of what they think is good or right. And therefore, the idea that we begin to tolerate these views about science actually starts to become slowly but surely policy, educational policy. And this has an effect on the way textbooks are written. This has an effect on the way teachers teach. And it has an effect on the way that school systems may deal with how are we going to teach subjects like science or evolution. I mean, if you think about it for a moment, the thing about evolution in particular, I mean, this is one of the things that gets people really.
Sure.
It's like biology. I mean, it's one thing to talk about cosmology or physics or, quantum mechanics or something, where our knowledge of those structures of nature are just beginning. They're really kind of not very deep. Biology is one of those things that we have an almost essential grasp as a science of what biological systems are. Evolution's a huge part of this, and not as a theory, but as a fact, as an actual mechanism in biological systems, in biological forms.
Right.
The chemistry of genetics and things. I mean, we have the most essential grasp of the mechanisms of life. And the idea that this is something that we would say, this becomes controversial and refuted in ignorance of this. This is one of those moments, I think, where, like the Greeks who invented the steam engine, but never developed it because they were afraid it would challenge the system of slavery.
Right.
This is really an incredible moment where you have this power. And I think what happens is that when you do have that power, that knowledge of power constrained to certain elites, you also get an incapacity of the public to assess or watch over what those elites might do. So you have what happened in China about a month ago with this rogue scientist who apparently did some genetic splicing in a baby. You're going to have this happen even more, or you're going to have capital or corporations start to take this knowledge for their own interest or benefit, or as opposed to the public good or public benefit. So there are really dangerous implications, I think, to all of this.
Absolutely. It's interesting because you're getting a little into the area of the divide between science and knowledge and what it can do for all versus what it does for those who have the ability to harness it and manipulate it, i.e., generally those who are in a position of authority. With futurism, Michael, I see this a lot with futurism. And, I guess it inevitably comes up in the conversation that, we don't want to call ourselves, modern Luddites or something like that in the capacity that we are averse to science and technology. But I think many people are afraid of what can happen when technology is available only for the few, which really, is kind of, you might compare that to government itself. Look at the current government shutdown. We have people in Washington who aren't directly affected, and then we have government employees who aren't elected officials, but nonetheless a part of that broader machine. They aren't being paid. I'm really concerned about what the long-term aspects of this may entail in terms of the way that the trickle-down effect affects people more broadly. And it always seems to come back to that. We, the people versus those, the few, whoever has the technology and who's able to wield it, those are the ones that we fear. And hence, innately, there seems to be a fear of what the applications of science and technology can be. However grounded in, reality or logic that fear may be, often it is not. With evolution, to me, there's another aspect to it also. I think that fear, it's an indelible part of all this, because that fear seems to be, well, now we look at ourselves and it reshapes what we think it means to be human, and that frightens people too, I think.
Yes, it does. It does reshape and that's part of the open versus the closed mind. Yeah. There are so many the idea that science is somehow, and this was part of the reaction against science in the late 18th, early 19th century with the kind of romantic movement in art and philosophy, was that science is going to make, and this is like the Frankenstein kind of, the novel Frankenstein kind of trope, which is that science and technology will disfigure man. It will disfigure our humanity. It will make us into something that's not as beautiful and wonderful as things were before. I just think this idea is something that needs to be combated. In many ways, science makes you look at nature in a much more appreciative way. Oh, yeah. Much more deeply beautiful way than in other ways of relating to nature. But I also think that, this really is even more important because our species has not, of the 10 to 12,000 years that we've been had civilization and sedentary forms of life, our species has not dealt with this level of systematic abstraction and interdependence as it has in the past 100 to 150 years. Economic systems, technological systems, and human beings, are going to react to this in many different ways. And it can go badly. It can go badly because either a democratic society becomes one that makes all forms of power accountable to the public interest. And that's the basic principle of, as I view it at least, of what is democratic. That whatever it is, whatever social power that's out there has to be accountable to public concerns and public interest, or we go back into our little holes of tradition, custom, identity. This seems to me to be the path we're taking. Not one that's saying, I want more accountability, but rather one that's saying, I want my rights respected so that I can live my life the way I want to. And so I think there's a real danger here because it's affecting liberals as well as conservatives. That what's being lost here in these debates is the fact that these forms of power, these technological forms of power, because again, going back to the concept of technology, it is about the concept of manipulation, of control. Norbert Wiener, one of the great scientists of the 20th century, has this wonderful book. It's called The Control of Man by Man. And it's about this idea of cybernetics. He's like, it's going that the capacity of our scientific capacity is going to get to the point where all our technological systems will be based on a few controlling the many. And this is exactly where these different technologies are taking us, because they're combined with private property, a private control, which was very different in, like I said before, in the 50s and 60s, when you had the state, the government financing, Bell Labs or different laboratories to come up with inventions and things. Technology itself is embedded in its political context.
Right.
The kind of technology we produce is a function of the kind of power relations that it occurs within. And that's why the democratic moment, if that is lost, then, because there's this assumption that technology has its own, we think our language is imbued with this myth that technology, just like the market, has its autonomous independence. Like, don't mess with it. Let it do what it has to do. Let it grow and develop and make its decisions, and don't get in the way of innovation. Don't get in the way of these things. This is a fear, a perversity thesis, right? The idea, like, if you touch it, you're going to screw it up. Try to control me, and we're not going to have these great things like cell phones and Candy Crush or whatever. This is a problem.
Yeah.
This is a problem because it's making people not only undemocratic in the sense of having the incapacity or lack of will, but also for those who are saying, no, I think democracy is important. It's creating perimeters around what democracy should be able to touch and what it shouldn't.
Yeah, absolutely. Something I want to come back to that you mentioned is the ways that politically we see the effects on both the right and the left. Now, you might say that, again, as we looked at over the last few decades in relation to policy and the way that it is governed by various different ideologies, that a broadly conservative ideology might influence policy in ways that could be seen as anti-science. On the other political side of things, we look at postmodernism, and this is something that truly fascinates me for a number of reasons, Michael. One being that many people see the effects, but they still have the question, I'm asked this all the time, what exactly, if you had to define it, what is postmodernism? Now, what I think we're talking about here generally, we're certainly not talking about architecture. Philosophical postmodernism. And this led me to go back and read Derrida and to read Foucault. And again, he's one that I think fundamentally was asking the right questions initially. Let's look back at history and let's see if science and what was considered leading edge at the time was always beneficial for us. But what that has turned into, and which has become, an ideology that is very embedded in aspects of, the modern academic way of thinking, is that, well, there's this relativism where there are really no such things as truth. And therefore, if everything's kind of wishy-washy, we can question everything, including science and a lot of the fundamentals of objectivity. Now, I want your opinion. This interests me, as you can tell. How is postmodernism equally a part of this problem in relation to the anti-science component of democracy?
I think postmodernism, if you get your mind around what postmodernism really is at its base, it's a conservative epistemology, reactionary epistemology that's wedded to left-wing principle. And what I mean by this is what postmodernists essentially did was pick up on all of the arguments or resonate with. It's just another manifestation of all the anti-rationalist arguments that have ever emerged since the age of the Greeks. And an example of this actually is from Islamic philosophy, ironically, from the 12th century. And the rationalists who believed that there was a rational structure to the world, reason governed the world in a regular way. We can know it. Human beings can therefore participate mentally in how the universe is structured. And then the great refute to this was, why does a ball of cotton burn? Because God wills it to burn. And that's it. Done. And what postmodernists do is something that's almost exactly the same. What all our reality is constructed by us. There is nothing that exists that is outside of our epistemological circle. So if you say that, relativity exists, well, clearly that can't be true because that's just one theory, one construct explaining an experience. There's no object there. What is a number? What is the essence of the number one? you'll never find it. Therefore, does it exist? Well, in your mind it exists, but that doesn't mean it exists objectively. So you can go on and on with this. But this is exactly the same kind of David Hume made the same argument in his skepticism, his argument against rationalism. And the argument was, well, you don't know that the next time you flip the coin that it's not going to stay up. You have no way of knowing this. All you know are patterns of experience. You have no predictive capacity. You've got no knowledge of the structures of nature. So postmodernism is dangerous because it was picked up in a way that wedded it to left-wing or kind of progressive, I suppose, principles coming out of the 1960s and 70s. And that was the idea that race is a construct.
Right.
Gender is a construct. All these things aren't real. Therefore, all the stuff you've been taught about things being eternal and essential isn't true. You can remake yourself into whatever you want. So it has this emancipatory role for certain kinds of people, and it has this very destructive role. So in many ways, postmodernism undermines objectivity, that's for sure. But postmodernism also gives people a way of doing what liberalism actually does also, which is give them a sense of their own identity and their own worldview, and basically keep others out.
Yeah,
and this is a problem.
Yeah, a real salient area right now, Michael, that we're seeing where this comes into effect, and it kind of gives us an example that we can put under the microscope here in this conversation. With regard to the social construct concept and its relationship with gender and sex, I have noticed that, again, it seems that we've had to really kind of separate the ideas and say, okay, sex is biological, gender is something that is preference-oriented. Many would still dispute that. I'm happy to operate in those terms, because as long as we understand the difference between them and their implications. But then we have, for instance, here's another aspect of policy shaping things, the question over a legal definition of sex and the apparent the lack of a acknowledgement of the difference, a separation between sex and gender. And then, of course, we had the Supreme Court recently upholding the Trump administration's argument against transgender people being able to serve in the military. Now, obviously, a lot of questions come to mind here. I think it's necessary that we understand, at least terminologically, some of the changes that have occurred as a result of the idea of postmodernism and social constructs and things. But is there a point where we begin to see here ideas and attitudes and philosophies and their conflict with government becoming really problematic?
Well, I think that I think probably the most salient part of this is it's pretty clear that if you make the distinction between, for example, sex and gender, that if you're operating in that space, you're at least operating within a responsible space, in the sense of saying that there are certain aspects of our social world that are constructed. There's no question about it.
Right.
It's absurd to say otherwise. A table is a social construct in the sense that it's a table rather than a piece of wood. So, there is that element to it. The problem is the way I frame this what's been happening, especially with the transgender ban and the attitudes about these things, is the moment is, we both can agree that, our concept of what sex is and gender is could be fluid or flexible. We don't know everything. We don't know whether there's a gene that controls your sexual preference. We don't know.
Sure.
But the real question is, does it matter, in the sense of the fact-based argument that was used by the Trump administration to repeal the admission of transgender people participate in the military was not based on fact. The arguments that they deployed, it was going to deal with morale, and then it was, it's going to drive up costs, medical costs, that the military has. None of these were factually accurate.
Seems ideological.
Which means that there is some sense which people think that being transgender is deviant. And if that's the case, what is wrong with this? And that's when that's when all reason breaks down. All reason begins to break down. And I think that's part of the anti-scientific argument, that, I don't need a reason anymore. I have power.
Oh, wow.
If I have power, I don't need reason. And that's what this is. I mean, so even if we don't know what the science is with respect to sexual preference and things like that, which I'm totally comfortable with, the real question when it hits the politics is the question of, like, well, for example, cancer in the 1950s. People thought you could catch cancer by being around them or something. This is anti-scientific. And it has social consequences about how our social relations operate, about who we tolerate and who we don't, who we stigmatize and who we don't. I mean, this is Scarlet Letter type of level of cultural activity. And I think, to me, that's what's most salient about what's been happening with this stuff, is the idea that, my own biases and prejudices, again, do not have to come under scrutiny based on fact. And that is where anti-science leads you into an anti-democratic space.
Absolutely. It's why I think this collection of essays is so important. Anti-Science and the Assault on Democracy is the collection. Of course, Michael Thompson is one of the co-editors. A couple more questions before I turn you loose. Something that is addressed in the book from time to time is the apparent rise of interest in self-help in our society, which I get the impression you kind of liken that in many ways to part of the sort of anti-science thinking. In what ways, or am I correct even in that assessment?
Well, it's not simply self-help as a broad concept, clearly.
Sure.
But it is the idea that instead of turning to, in other words, part of what this phenomenon really is this attempt by some people, at least, or some movements, to rely on really just honestly pseudoscientific means for personal health or for psychological health. I'm thinking of things like that Gwyneth Paltrow, the Goop device, the egg or whatever this thing was, which was sued by the state of California for making basically pseudoscientific arguments. And this is just one example of or just pseudo-psychological kind of techniques with, self-help gurus teaching you like to access your inner drives or something. Nothing. All of this stuff really is about how you create dependence on others. One of the things about Freud that's so fascinating in psychoanalysis was that he was attempting to try to understand scientifically patterns that would kind of generate neuroses, say, or ways of like reducing neurosis, and this was a scientific enterprise. It had scientific method. Its methodology was a little different because the nature of the object was different. But there are certain things that we know about what it means to be a human being, about our experiences and what kind of neuroses can develop as a result of certain kinds of relations and things like that, processes. The self-help stuff is completely anti-scientific. In other words, it becomes a kind of way of saying, listen to me, I have the key. You're unique, you're special, and I'm going to unlock your inner potential. And all this is a kind of substitute, a secularization for the kind of psychological needs of religion. It's a need to not depend on oneself and one's reason. It's a need to depend on another. And I think this is also an expression of part of the anti-democratic features of modern culture.
That's very interesting, the way that you relate that to the secularization of fundamental religious needs. That's something I think that people have, though, is that we have evolved essentially over time to need the feeling of, well, there's something more. And whether or not that actually exists, thinking so seems to make us feel better. Now, I've seen guys like Sam Harris, for instance. On the other hand, he tries to promote a sort of secular spirituality, almost, I guess, in acceptance of this fundamental need that humans seem to have, but in promotion of a more scientific attitude. Is that the kind of thing that you think would be a less harmful version, or maybe even a constructive way that these kinds of ideas, these fundamental needs that humans seem to have, could be engaged in a way that is practical, that is skeptical even, and that removes the loosey-goosey kind of stuff that we see with so much self-help?
I think our culture, modern culture, really has not evolved, or the cultural mechanisms that previous cultures had developed for dealing with moral, psychological, and emotional dilemmas that emerge within their community. And I'm thinking, for example, that were pre-Christian cultures like, classical Athens, for example, where, of course, there were pagan religions, but they were very light in terms of their role in society. They evolved cultural practices of the theater, of poetry, of ways of dealing with very human problems, contradictions, and experiences that, say, clean philosophy or science couldn't really resolve. And this is okay. I mean, it's not like science can answer every question, but it's also true that there were ways that, by going to the theater and watching Oedipus Rex or watching some, great Greek tragedy, that the community itself would be able to go through some kind of catharsis or therapy about the kind of problems that their community were facing.
Right.
And so you get this, I guess, at the apex of, say, like the 19th and early 20th century, people like Eugene O'Neill or Henrik Ibsen, right? Theater was a communal experience. It was something where people could discuss and talk about. Art, literature has this capacity to do this, but this has also been disintegrating. That's a very different discussion than the question of science, but it's true. And I think a lot of this has to do with the fact that human beings do need answers, or at least to explore the depths of the kind of questions that they have about the existential questions that they have. But we have fewer and fewer mechanisms for that. And science alone is not going to be able to answer those questions. But science, I believe, and scientific attitude is a crucial component to being open to new experience. Because, if you really think about another crucial facet of scientific method, it's experimentation.
Yeah.
And experiment is not just about experimenting for some objective truth. Experiment can also become a kind of way that you figure your own problems out instead of, say, cringing back into custom and tradition. Experiment is a really crucial aspect. Play, imagination, very important aspects of science. So in a lot of ways, these kind of things can help us perhaps deal with a lot of existential issues if our culture could just get it together with respect to how to focus on those questions. So I do think science can actually be a part of this, an openness to the new, an openness to feeling and experiment and new experience. That is absolutely crucial.
Absolutely. Michael J. Thompson, thank you for joining me here on the Middle Theory Podcast.
Thanks, Micah. Thanks for having me.